Hi, I'm Sarah Fitzgerald, and I live here in Falls Church. I'm retired from a career mostly as a journalist, including 15 years as an editor and new media developer at the Washington Post. I grew up in Michigan and attended University of Michigan, where I studied history and journalism, and when I was there back in the 1970s, I became particularly interested in women's history, and I've written some biographies about some women who I think were important but are not very well known to the rest of us.
How do you feel about people getting discriminated just because of their gender, skin, or culture?
Well, I don't think it's a very good idea. I went to college about 50 years ago, and one of the things that happened when I was in college that I discovered when I was there is that my university, which was the University of Michigan, the admissions officers had a male-female quota, and I didn't know about it at the time. I went to high school in the suburbs of Detroit, and what I learned was that they were concerned because girls were starting to do better in high school than boys were, and because of the culture at the time, they were concerned if there was what one of them called an overbalance of women in the freshman class, because this was in the years after World War II, and there was a real culture that the place of girls and women were being mothers and being in the home and taking care of their families. And so if you had too many women who were doing well and going out and getting jobs, that would sort of disrupt what they viewed the natural order of things. So at the time, they had a quota of 55% men, 45% women, even though there's obviously an equal number of boys and girls, right? And so I didn't know when I was admitted that I actually had to do better in school than the boy sitting next to me in order to be able to get into Michigan, which was a public university. And when people started to find out about these things and challenge them, they realized that that was actually a mistake, and it changed the policies. But sometimes when you're experiencing discrimination, you don't always realize it, particularly if other people have protected you from it when you were growing up.
Yeah, and why do you think that all of this is happening? Why are people discriminated or treated differently?
Well, some of it is the cultures they grew in, what they were taught as children. There's a song in a musical that came out, and there's a couple that, and one when I was growing up, it was from a musical called South Pacific, and the point of the song was you've got to be taught, and it made the point that prejudice starts with what people learn when they're children. And sometimes it's just a matter of where you grew up and, you know, what the people around you were like and whether you knew people of different races or cultures. And I think one of the things that I like about living in Falls Church is we have quite a bit of diversity here. We don't necessarily have a lot of economic diversity, but we can meet people from all different races and cultures and, you know, religions, but it's not that way in all parts of the United States. So if you haven't had the chance to meet people and get to know them as people, it's sometimes easy to grow up thinking that they are a certain way.
And why do you think even after there's been like laws and protests like for equal pay for all people, it's still happening?
Well, a lot of these practices are, you know, hard to break and to change people's minds. And again, they may not, you know, they may think, well, yes, I agree there shouldn't be a difference, but then it creeps, you know, into subtle things. Like when I was working, I know that even though I certainly felt that men and women should be paid the same amount, I sometimes was in circumstances when I realized that my male partners were expecting bigger salaries than I had expected. And so when people ask for more money, they're likely going to get more money. So one of the things that they're realizing, for instance, in the case of women, that they need to start to think about asking for more salaries if they're going to, you know, end up getting what their male peers do. So sometimes it's just really subtle things like that. And it's why it's important for people to have role models and to see people who are making some of these changes, because then you can start to think, oh, that's something I could do too.
And how do you think COVID has changed the pay gap? Or the amount of
Well, that's an interesting question. It's hard for me a little bit because I'm retired, so I'm now out, not working anymore. I think it's obviously made some different challenges, some possibly for the good, some possibly not so good. My son and daughter-in-law have small children at home, so in some ways it may be harder for parents if they're trying to take care of their kids, particularly when schools weren't meeting and they had to take care of childcare when they were home. And from what I read in the paper, a lot of times some women felt they had no choice but to quit their jobs and stay home because they couldn't afford childcare. Their families couldn't afford childcare, and the childcare places were closing down. And so, their children they felt had to come first. Sometimes, though, people in my son's family, for instance, he's actually now the person it's easier for him to work from home. So he's often the one who's looking after, his kids if they've got a sick day or something like that. Now, one thing I think maybe has helped is for people who they've discovered they don't have to be in the office every day. They can work at a distance, and perhaps people aren't spending as long commuting or having to rush home to take care of their kids after school. So that may be a plus. And people are different. Some people really like the camaraderie of being around what they say the water cooler in the office and having interaction with their friends. And you probably find this among some of your friends too. You miss the social aspect of school. But other people who are more introverted, they might actually like the quiet of their homes and being able to focus more. And so I think whether it helped people or not may depend a lot on what kind of people they are.
Yeah.
Do you have a question? Any more questions?
No.
I see 3 questions on the screen. So.
How do you think that we can get there? Like, how do you think we can get to a place that, everyone's treated the same?
Well, I think awareness and talking about it and thinking about it is very important. To ask yourself, is everybody being included? Who could be included? I was lucky in that and I feel I was luckier than women who were 5 or 10 years older than I was, because when I came through college and was starting to go to work, people were starting to ask questions about maybe we need more women in the workplace. And in the late 1970s, I was trained as a journalist, and I was interviewed by the Washington Post. And at that point, they had about 10 editors who were supervising the local coverage and assigning reporters what to cover and, deciding what stories are we going to write about local government and schools and crime and health and things like that. And at that time, only one of those editors was a woman. And she got an opportunity to go off and be in a program where she was going to go for a year. And I think they sort of looked around and they said, oh, half of our readers are women. Maybe we should have a few more women in here figuring out what we should write about. Because while women and men can be interested in the same things, they can also have interests that can be very different. And so I was lucky that at the time I was going into the workforce, people were starting to ask those questions and to recognize that if you get more points of view, it actually can be very good and healthy for an organization and also save you from a lot of potential problems. I think, sadly, the train goes in fits and starts, that things will happen that will speed it up for a while and changes are made, but then other forces take over. This was brought home to me. One of the women I wrote a book about was a woman who had been involved with the battle for the Equal Rights Amendment back in the 1970s, which is something that we still haven't ratified. And some people will argue, well, you don't need it anymore because all the laws that kept women out of certain jobs and things have been taken off the books. But as we've all learned, you can be given rights, and the rights can also sometimes be taken away. And so a few years ago, up until a few years ago, the Equal Rights Amendment had not been ratified in Virginia. And so I went down to the legislature and I took my then three-year-old granddaughter to go with me because she lived in the legislative district of someone who hadn't supported the amendment. And as I was sitting there, I had this sense of deja vu, and I realized that I was now older than the woman I had written about, who had been in the same position. And I laughed too, because when she took this job to be a lobbyist, one of the reasons she was chosen was because she was thought to be a very smart politician, but because she was older, she was described as gray-haired and matronly looking, and that made her safe, that she wouldn't threaten people. And so I laughed. I said, well, now I'm older than she is, and somebody might describe me as gray-haired and matronly looking. But it reminded me of all these years had gone by, and we still hadn't achieved this goal. And going back to my time at University of Michigan, when I was in school, they had a protest in which this university was shut down for a week or so by a group that called themselves the Black Action Movement. And at the time, they wanted the university to set a goal of admitting the same percentage of black students that was the population in Michigan. And they also wanted the university to provide more support for students if they were admitted to Michigan so they would be successful. And the university did this, and they have made a lot of improvements. But while the percentage of students of color has grown a lot since then, the percentage of students who are black still remains stubbornly small.
Interesting.
So it requires continued, vigilance and hard work. And unfortunately, I think sometimes, and you're seeing a little bit of it now in Congress, I think, or in other certain parts of the country, where people who have been in power start to get frightened if they think they're going to lose some of that power. And so they can start to feel threatened when there's really no need for them to feel that way.
Madeleine Albrightt just passed away, I think, yesterday, and she was the first Secretary of State. You have the first black female Supreme Court Justice is about to sit there. From your seat, is that progress?
Well, it's progress. It's all incremental. One of the things, I read the interview, or rather the obituary of Madeleine Albrightt, because she was somebody whose career I followed and admired a lot. And I chuckled when I got to the end, where because she, I don't know if you read it, but she said when she looked back at her career, she felt progress had been made because she said her granddaughter was unimpressed that she was the first woman Secretary of State because she, there have been 3 women Secretaries of State since then, Condoleezza Rice, Hilary Clinton, and one other. And so they said, what's the big deal? 3 out of the last 4 Secretaries of State have been women. And so you say, well, yeah, that is progress, But it was, it was hard for Albright. It was really interesting to read about her career because, and they were all, one of the things, when Hilary Clinton graduated from college as an undergrad, women could still not be admitted to Harvard and Yale. And so I remember the Post a while back doing some analysis of whether the Obama cabinet members had gone to Ivy League schools, And it was like the reporter was younger and hadn't really focused on the fact that at the time she went through school, women couldn't get into Harvard and Yale. They could attend the professional schools. And you know, during the time I was at Michigan, the University of Virginia did not admit young undergraduate women until 1970. That was after when I was already in college. And so again, a lot of these practices, you know, are long-standing. My parents certainly always generally gave me the view that I could be whatever I wanted and do whatever I wanted, but sometimes you can, you know, have.
That is amazing.
And I'm careful about how I say that because I didn't want to claim it. You know, people later told me I could claim it, but during the World War II years, when a lot of students went overseas, there were women who were running the paper, and if you looked back, you know, they didn't have that title, but
right.
But well, one of the things, and I didn't think about this at the time, but I thought about it when I was older, that was, you know, challenging for me, and I suspect lots of people, whether it's Madeleine Albright or Hilary Clinton, is that when you're the first person in that kind of job, you don't have any models for how you should do your job. And I mean, all your models were males.